It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Dr. Peter Hurst, Associate Dean, MIT Sloan Executive Education. Dr. Hurst, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all around the world, wherever you are, and welcome from Cambridge, Massachusetts, the MIT Sloan School of Management. We're here today for the 18th webinar in our Innovation at Work webinar series. The Innovation at Work webinar series is designed to bring to you faculty who teach in our executive education programs and spend some time hearing what their latest research and ideas are. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Deborah Ancona, who is the Seeley Distinguished Professor of Management, a Professor of Organization Studies, and the Faculty Director of the MIT Leadership Center. I think perhaps one of the longer titles we've had presenting in these webinar series. We have over 2,300 people registered all over the world today, so we're very excited to be spending this time with Professor Ancona. Deborah teaches extensively in executive education, and as if that isn't enough things to spend her time on, she's also a highly respected and pioneering researcher in the field of leadership, and one of the most respected researchers on the ideas around distributed leadership that we're going to hear a little bit more about, I suspect, this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. I will, as you heard in the announcement, be presenting some of the questions that you asked during the course of the presentation to Deborah. Please feel free to ask those questions online as they occur to you as we go through, so that I can compile them and we can have a great conversation in the second half of this webinar. So with that, I would like to hand over to Professor Deborah Ancona.
Well, thank you, Peter, and let me join my welcome to everybody who is participating today. It's great to have you on board. Before I get started with what I'm going to talk about, which is this topic of distributed leadership, we thought it would be interesting to see who's in the audience. So I'm going to actually ask Cole if you can push out the first of the polling questions, which looks at the regions represented in the audience. So you have only about 10 seconds. If you could fill out the poll, then we'll get a sense of where folks are from. And Cole, as soon as we have the answers to that, it would be great to push out the results. Okay, so it looks like mostly U.S. and Canada, but we're represented in Central and South America, Europe, and a few folks from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So great. Again, welcome to everybody. Okay. Leading in a world of uncertainty, that is the name of this particular presentation. And we say that all the time. People are talking about uncertainty, the dynamic nature of the current world situation. There's a lot of data that represents what that means. But what I like to do in starting out is to show a video that gets us to actually feel how the pace of change affects us. So let's get started right there. Cole, if you could run that video, then we can all get nervous together. Okay, well, I don't know about you, but that video, which I have seen a number of times, by the way, you can look at that video, the full video on YouTube. It's called Did You Know? But it always makes me quite anxious because we are living in these exponential times, and that creates a lot of anxiety and stress. Given the changing nature of our environment, and of course, actually, different people in the audience will have a different sense of how much change is going on and how quickly that change is moving and how much uncertainty there is. So actually, before I move on again, maybe we can just do a poll of what industries are represented in the audience. So Cole, if you could put that poll up, we again will get a sense of where folks in the audience are working. So if you could all fill that out, then Cole will post the results. Cole, do we have that data yet? All right, well, I'm going to just keep going, and we'll see if we can get that come out later. At any rate, given this volatile, changing, uncertain environment, what we've found is that there have been changes in the strategic direction of many, many different companies given their attempts to adapt and change to that environment. And strategies have been moving for the past 15 years or so from an emphasis on economies of scope and scale, where companies would figure out their niche in the marketplace and then really drive to become as efficient as possible in that particular domain. But we've moved from that focus on the large-scale niche to a focus of what strategy people call dynamic capabilities. That is, the way to competitive advantage is not through just efficiencies, but through innovation, speed, and agility. And so in order to make that change in strategy happen, organizations have also been switching or moving in their organizational forms. And so we see a move from bureaucracies, command and control, to looser, more networked firms, which rely much more on collaboration. So jobs are loosening up. Job titles are loosening up. We have fewer and fewer levels of hierarchy, more use of teams, more fuzzy boundaries. So where the organization used to be highly bounded, now the key to organizational effectiveness and innovation is actually moving outside of the organization, collaborating with different parts of the ecosystem. And so again, what we see is a change in strategy and a change in organizational design. And the question that I'm really asking is, how does leadership need to change as we move from the left side of the continuum to the right side of the continuum? And that move, that shift, is what we call distributed leadership. One more time, we're going to see if we can do a poll and ask the question of where are you? Where are you on this continuum? Since many, many organizations are trying to get from the left to the right, we'd like to poll with the question of where are you? Are you just thinking about it, or are you really completely over into the network collaborative systems approach? So if everybody could fill that out, that would be great. Okay, so it looks like we're, again, have a distribution in the audience, which is great. Some folks are just thinking about it, and I think it would be hard-pressed to say that there's any place that people aren't at least thinking about it. There are a lot of folks who are starting the process. The bulk are already actively engaged. It doesn't look like many folks have completed the process, and that's been our experience as well. I know in the programming that we do, particularly in the companies that we work with in executive education, a huge part of what we do is helping organizations make this move from bureaucracies to networks. So great. What I'm interested in, again, is work that examines companies that are all the way over to the right. The idea being, can we learn from firms that have already made these transitions? In fact, for many of them, they didn't have to have any kind of change at all because they were born. We call them DNA organizations because they were born as networked firms. That's how they started out. And so our question was, what can we learn if we look at the leadership patterns in those particular organizations? And again, the topic is distributed leadership. So in this kind of organization, leadership is much more distributed. That means that many of the functions traditionally in the hands of top leadership are further down in the organization. In fact, leadership can and actually must take place anywhere and everywhere in the organization. So even low down, and this is the thing that's really important, the locus of innovation in these more networked firms is much, much lower in the organization. All up and down the organizations, but particularly at lower levels, there are leaders sensing and seizing opportunities. They are the ones coming up with new products, with new processes, with new business models. So the locus of innovation is with multiple leaders up and down the organization, but particularly with the folks who are further down. In fact, our research really was quite amazing as we looked at who is coming up with these new ideas, and we had to really push down low in the organization to figure that out. So in this kind of distributed leadership environment, information flows wherever it needs to flow, and decisions get made by many people up and down the organizational hierarchy. There is both top-down decision-making. So what that means is we're not saying that there's no leadership at the top. There is very strong leadership at the top, but that leadership, again, permeates all levels, and there's both top-down and bottom-up decision-making. In this session, what I would like to do is get into the fine-grained parts of what a distributed leadership organization looks like. What are some of the individual leadership capabilities of these entrepreneurial leaders who are coming up with all these new ideas? How do they then create teams, and how do those teams function? And then the big question is, how do you also create a context that supports that entrepreneurial leadership and that form of teaming? So one of the things that we've been working on for a while that comes up again as we examine entrepreneurial leadership up and down these organizations are 4 capabilities that characterize leadership. And those who have taken the TLS class, Transforming Your Leadership Signature, your leadership strategy, have seen this before. It should be very familiar to you. Some of you have probably not seen it. So on the top, we see visioning, painting a picture of the future. So in order to get people excited, leaders need to be able to paint a picture of what the future looks like. Relating, having to do with building trusting relationships inside and outside of both your team and the company. If this is all about a networked world where you're reaching out into the ecosystem, then you need to be able to relate to those people that you're reaching out to collaborate with. Inventing, it's creating new agile processes and structures to move toward the vision. How do we get this done? How do we get rid of all the impediments in the way? What is a new way of approaching this particular task? So those are 3 of the 4 capabilities. The one that really stands out as important in these distributed leadership companies, the capability that is most focal in our work, is sense-making. And sense-making is not a typo. It's a word that was created and a concept created by Carl Weick from the University of Michigan. And sense-making is just what it sounds like, making sense of the context in which you are operating. Making sense of the context in which you are operating. So basically, if you've got a very volatile, changing environment, then you can't just act in it. You need to really understand what's different now than what existed just a short while ago. And so keeping track of those changes and mapping those changes is a core part of what sense-making involves. One of the biggest, and again in the class we get into much more depth on all four of these capabilities, but one of the core aspects of sense-making is letting go of your existing models of the world. And that's not that easy. So some of you know I also teach a course with Tara Swart on neuroscience and leadership. And what we know is once you have a view, an idea, a model, a schema of the world, that actually becomes wired into the brain. And so that's sort of our go-to way of thinking about the world. But in sense-making, what we're asking is to change your very pattern of thinking and seeing and understanding what that world looks like now that change has occurred. So just to give that a little bit of context, there's a great team at Bose that was working on new technologies for speakers, and they were going to suggest or they were going to ask for some resources from top management to create a miniaturized speaker. And they knew that this was going to be a really, really big problem because the notion in the company, the mental model in the company was that if you went too small, then your ability to have the sound quality that was required in a company that has its reputation based on quality was not going to be there. And yet this team had done its sense-making. It knew where technology was going. It knew where design technology was going. It knew that there was a demand for this product. So they had really mapped that competitive environment very, very carefully. They had done their sense-making, and so they went ahead. They ended up getting resources, and that ended up being one of the best-selling products that they have. But it was a fight because they had to, again, push against. They had to do their own sense-making and then help the organization to change the way that it saw the competitive environment. Another example of great sense-making at a higher level in the organization is Jeff Immelt, and I had the privilege of being able to present at GE on some of these ideas and have dinner with Jeff Immelt and some of his top leadership. And Jeff Immelt, when you have drinks at one of these gatherings, it's not just the social, let's drink and have nice little chats. No, everybody, when I was there, was sitting around in a circle, and basically they all did collective sense-making. So they'd sit around, and Jeff Immelt would say, okay, well, tell us what's going on in your industry, what's going on in your part of the world, and that person would report out on, okay, this is where we are, these are some of the challenges we're facing, these are some of the trends that we're seeing, this is where we're doing well, this is where we're not doing well. And by virtue of going around the room, everybody in that group did collective sense-making. They left the drink hour with a much better map of what was going on in the environment for the entire company in different parts of the organization. And so sense-making is really important whether you're at low levels of the organization or high levels of the organization. However, actually, before we do that, I just got prompted by my slide. It'd be fun to just get a sense. I know I haven't given you a whole lot of background on the four capabilities, but we thought it would be fun just to get a sense of where you as an audience feel like you're distributed across sense-making, visioning, relating, and inventing. So if Cole could put out that first question of what is your biggest strength, and people could fill that out, and then we'll see those results and move on to your greatest weakness. So again, is your strength in visioning, seeing the future, relating, being able to reach out to people, inventing new ways of organizing to get to the vision? Okay, well, visioning, this is a visioning audience. That's interesting. But visioning and relating are the two highest scores, with sense-making pretty close to that, and inventing far away. So interesting kind of thing. Okay, and let's move on to weaknesses if we could. So those are strengths. And where are your greatest weaknesses? The good news, given that distribution, is altogether we could be great leaders. Okay, well, not surprisingly, inventing is one of the biggest weaknesses because it was rated lowest as the strength, but relating is up there as well. So good, that gives us a good sense of where you are. Okay. However, understanding your own individual leadership profile is actually not enough, because leaders soon learn that you can't do it alone. To the extent that you are working on tough, edgy problems, trying to invent the future, trying to understand a changing environment, it's very hard to do that as an individual contributor. So these entrepreneurial leaders that we see in these DNA companies are busy trying to attract others to their project ideas. So the idea, in praise of the incomplete leader, which is the name of the article that we wrote, says you can't do it all alone, so who can you attract? Who else can you bring up to bring into your team? We call this teaming. It's actually not, the word is from Amy Edmondson over at Harvard, where in these organizations, people are not necessarily assigned to teams. It's the work of the entrepreneurial leader to pull people together, get them excited about what they're doing, and in getting them excited, they also may vet the problem a little bit more, because people come in and say, hey, great idea, but maybe you should do this, or maybe you should do that. And so teaming begins to put a collective intelligence toward solving the problem at hand, but also helps to create collective vetting, and ideas improve through that process. And through teaming, teams get formed to follow up on new products, new processes, new business models that are created by the entrepreneurial leaders. For these teams, it actually is not enough just to come together. What those teams need as they continue to invent and get more innovative in the work that they do is to think about what mindset they bring to a situation. Mindset, I don't mean in the colloquial sense, but rather as Carol Dweck talks about it. And mindset has to do with whether or not you believe that intelligence, talent, and leadership are fixed. That is, given some amount, given some yardstick, you are at a particular level. You are either smart or you're dumb. You're born a leader or you're not. You have talent or you don't. So it's fixed. There's a given range and you are somewhere fixed on that yardstick. Versus a learning mindset, where the belief is that you can grow and develop. Just because you might be low somewhere on that yardstick, with a learning mindset, you believe that you and others around you can move on that yardstick. You can improve, you can learn. And it turns out that the mindset that you bring to a situation has huge implications for how you act, for how you lead, for how you operate. And I have a list of things here. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I highly recommend her book, Mindset. But the key is, I'll go through a couple of them. One is embracing challenge. So if you have a fixed mindset, often you don't embrace challenge. So experiments have been done, for example, at the University of Hong Kong, where students knew that if they took a course in English, they didn't speak English very well, and they took a course over the summer, they would do better in the program. And yet people with a fixed mindset were much less likely to sign up for that course in English. Why? Because they didn't want to be shown up as not being good, not being adequate. Their English was not good. So rather than help themselves, they actually didn't take on the challenge because they're protective of their own image to others. People with a learning mindset were much more apt to embrace the challenge, to say, let's go, let's learn. So the key here is, the third one, is that being wrong or not doing well is seen as a learning opportunity. It's not seen as a horrible failure. In fact, this is real. Carol Dweck actually started all this work on mindset. That is, she was working with kids at the time before she got to adults. And in children, she was expecting that when they failed on particular tasks, they would get depressed and they wouldn't want to do anymore. And that happened for a lot of kids. But for some of them, even though they got problems wrong and failed, they said, oh, that's interesting. What happened there? Why do you think that happened? What could I do differently? And so they brought a very, very different mindset to the particular problem at hand. And so that's what got her started on this research. And so teams, if they're going to be innovative, need to be able to take on this learning mindset. But that's not all that teams have to do. Teams actually have to really operate in a very different way. And this gets into a model that Henrik Bresman and I worked on, as well as David Caldwell for many years, on the notion of X teams. And what this says is that most of the best-selling textbooks on teams, most of what is trained in our leadership development programs focuses on the internal dimensions of teams. That is, building trust and creating clear roles and clear goals and good communication and effective meetings, and the focus is all inside. But what are we talking about? We're talking about this volatile, changing environment. We're talking about the need to connect and collaborate across team boundaries and organizational boundaries. So in fact, those very team-building exercises may be tightening up a team boundary rather than focusing on what an X team does, which is, we give it the language of out before in. Before you figure out how you're going to work as a team, you better go out and understand what's going out in the external environment. And through the research that we've done over many, many years, and it's not just us, there's research done by others as well in manufacturing teams, sales teams, top management teams, hardware teams, software teams, all kinds of teams, and this is a very robust finding that says that teams have to engage in 3 particular kinds of external interventions if they are going to be part of this distributed leadership organization, if they are going to be able to reach out and innovate. And so they have to do their sense making, so just like the individual entrepreneurial leader, teams operating in these kinds of systems also have to go out and map the competitive environment, who else is doing what in the organization, so you can create synergies within the organization. That team at Bose went and studied students at BU to see what were they using for speakers and what was in their backpack, how much room was there to stick a speaker in. So very kind of intensive, let's learn about what the customer wants and needs or would be excited by. Let's learn what are our competitors doing right now so that we don't build a product or create a new business model that's going to be dead before it hits the water. All of those things are part of what the team needs to do. But in political organizations, teams also need to reach up and connect what they're doing to strategic directions within the company. And so ambassadorship is making sure that what you're doing connects to the strategy of the organization or can be presented. Like the Bose team, as I said, they had to get funding from top management, and the top management wasn't necessarily all that excited. So part of what they did was work to get those top managers to see how great this product was and how it could help the company. And so that was the ambassador activity that they did. And finally is task coordination, because if you are creating a new business or in getting a new product out the door, chances are you can't do it alone. That team has to coordinate with other parts of the organization. So making sure that the other parts of the organization are on board, they understand what the priorities are, that it's clear who's doing what when, is again part of what teams need to do in this changing environment. So again, we have entrepreneurial leaders who are reaching out with new ideas. They are working to do their sense making and visioning, et cetera, and then attracting others into teams through a teaming process. Once that team is formed, that team is operating not only to bring about great internal process, but also to reach out to do its sense making, ambassadorship, and task coordination. And again, if you're interested in this, there are articles, there's a book, and we go through this in more depth in the TLS class. However, what we've learned through a lot of interventions with the many companies that we have worked with in the past is it's not enough to get people excited and moving in different directions as leaders further down in the organization, and to get them teaming and to get them to operate as X teams. What you really, really need is an environment that helps people, that encourages people to step out, that encourages people to not give up if they fail, that doesn't punish people for the failures that they have. And so the question becomes, how do you create that context? How do you architect the process so that you can move from the bureaucratic organization, which is not just a structure, but it's also a culture, it's a set of norms, it's a way of operating, to the more ecosystem world that we see here, where you're constantly having to work with and through other people, other teams, and other organizations. And so the key here is what we call changing the game, or creating the game board on which entrepreneurial leaders can play, X teams can operate, and there's a just more fluid movement as people join teams, get new ideas out, get new products out, and then come back into the system and start the process all over again. So first is freedom, to get to choose a little bit about what your work is, and to reward people for sensing and seizing opportunities. So one of the companies that we studied in this work on distributed leadership is a company called W.L. Gore. W.L. Gore, many of you know from Gore-Tex, which is in your winter gear, in North Face jackets, or I don't want to pick on North Face, all of the different outdoor brands use Gore-Tex as a product, and they have a fabrics division but also a medical division, and they use something called PTFE, which is a particular molecule that, for example, in clothing will let air come in but keep water out. They'll have filtration systems that let water through but keep contaminants out. So PTFE is the molecule that enables that kind of product to come out the door. But part of what they do is let people learn the organization before sometimes they even have a job. That is, their first job is to create a network, is to learn how the organization operates, is to learn how they can have an impact on sensing and seizing opportunities. So a very different way of crafting how the organization actually operates. Second part is this bottom-up and top-down decision-making. So one of the biggest issues in transitioning, as many of you are, from bureaucracies to more distributed leadership networked organizations, is that managers will come and say, yes, 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 we want to do that. And we get people further down in the organization working and being more entrepreneurial. But then when they come up with ideas, the top or the middle of the organization will say, oh, no, 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 we can't do that. Can't go there. That's not allowed. Well, that's not really what I was thinking. And so it's easy to say bottom-up and top-down decision-making, but actually implementing this is not that easy. And so one has to be able to listen. one has to be able to not only listen but support the people who are coming up with new ideas, and to be able to then actually pull together the ideas coming up from below and creating strategies out of that. So it's a kind of engine of innovation where the top is pulling on the collective knowledge within the company as new ideas come forward, and that's where strategy evolves from both bottom-up ideas as well as top-down scouting. Another piece is just-in-time resources and structures. So in many organizations, I know I've been in a lot of them, you have a new idea, you have to wait till the once-a-year budgeting process comes along. And 1 month before budgeting, nobody does any work because all you're doing is putting your proposal together to get into the budgeting cycle. And then the ideas come in, it takes another month before decisions are made, and then you may or may not get the resources. In organizations operating in this new way, resources are a little bit more ubiquitous, and you can create the team as necessary. We had, again, many different instances of innovation. One person wanted to, he was actually working in Home Depot, and he saw how much screens were costing in Home Depot, and Gore had been working on, they actually sold the mesh that went into the screens. But he was looking and couldn't believe how expensive the screens were. And he goes, this is ridiculous. We're selling for pennies what someone is getting a huge markup on. And so his idea was to get into the screen business. Why shouldn't we do that? And that's just because he was visiting Home Depot. But then he came in with the idea, and first what he needed to do is just do a little bit of research. So there were pots of resources around where he could do some market research to say, is this a viable market for us? Can we get in here and manufacture this? So a little bit of funding, which got into a more funding as the proposal grew. But the key is that there were resources available at different parts of the organization if you could convince people that this was a great idea. You need a strong culture of trust, so people have to know how do you pick products, because there's a choice process, right? Lots of ideas mean that you have to choose among them. If you're in an organization, and again, I've seen many like this, where all the ideas that are coming forward go into a room and the management comes out and says, we've decided on X, Y, and Z without any rationale, that really cuts the willingness of people to innovate and to try to come up with these entrepreneurial ideas. And so transparency, how are decisions made, or getting multiple people from throughout the organization to make those choice decisions, supporting a learning mindset, this learning from mistakes, not punishing people, are all part of a difference in the way a culture needs to operate if it is going to be able to make this move from the bureaucracy to the more networked form with distributed leadership. Simple rules. Here I highly recommend a book by Don Sol and Kathy Eisenhart. The idea that when you're in a bureaucracy, you have layers and layers. It used to be huge binders. Now in an electronic world, it's just many different files of all the rules and regulations and forms that you have to fill out to do anything. In distributed leadership organizations, there are much more simple rules that direct and get people not to be chaotic in what they're inventing, but to be aligned with where the organization is going. So a simple rule might be, don't work on anything that's not going to make us $250 million in the marketplace, because our business model has to be with bigger kinds of projects. It can't be 1,000 small ones. A simple rule might be use these technologies. A simple rule might be we need X% of our product for 3-year time frames, 5-year time frames, 10-year time frames, so that people can judge for themselves where products or processes or ideas are needed and adjust their creativity and innovative process accordingly. So some roles for you to think about is not only can you be worried about telling people what to do, but can you coach people as they begin to take on entrepreneurial activity? How can you be a role model for your team? How are you spending your time? If you tell people that we're trying to do less bureaucratic work, but that makes up 50% of your calendar, that's not sending the right kind of message. Culture creator. What are the norms that you have in your organization, and how do they need to change? In order for people to be able to innovate, they need to understand the business model. To what extent are you communicating that to the people that you're working with? And designer. To what extent are you pulling people together, bringing those synergies out of the organization and creating the simple rules that will help you navigate this new world that we're all trying to adapt to. So with that, I'll give you just a couple of minutes before we get into the Q&A to just think about some changes that you might make starting tomorrow maybe, or over the next month or two, to start changing the game in your organization, whether it's something that you do, a way of approaching teams, a way of designing an organization. How can you think about helping your organization to make that move to a more distributed organizational system? So we'll just give you a minute or two to think about that, and then move into Q&A.
So thank you, Deborah. Perhaps while people are reflecting for themselves on that, we can return towards the end of the Q&A to what some of your advice specifically might be. But in the meantime, we've had a lot of questions coming in, so let me try to start going through those.
Okay, I'll try to answer them.
Yes, great. Well, one set of questions has to do with, you gave in the limited time a couple of examples of companies that you have studied. So people are quite interested in, those sound like product and technology kind of companies. Mm-hmm. To what extent do these ideas play out the same, different, in different sectors, so perhaps in service companies, or even maybe in the public sector or with international organizations?
Sure, that's a great question, and sorry, I at the moment am working primarily with technology companies, as you well know, particularly pharmaceutical area, so that tends to be my focus. But we have implemented X teams, and people have implemented them themselves or just designed them from the very beginning. I mean, we created this model by looking at how great innovative companies actually operate. And we have seen that certainly in the service sector, consulting companies, we've been working with some law firms that are actually trying to get more externally oriented and pull people together more. So, so certainly in service areas, in all kinds of organizations. In fact, I would argue that an X team is just a way of operating, and it could be used everywhere. And in fact, one of the biggest, saddest kinds of statistics around has to do with employee engagement. Employees are not engaged. The numbers are very sad, something in the 70s, and I think depending on the poll, it differs. But there are a lot of people who are not engaged. Something like 24 to 25% are actively disengaged with work. A big question comes up with millennials. How do we get millennials more excited and motivated about working? And it seems to me that it would not be that hard to, instead of putting everybody in front of a cubicle and asking them to work that way for 12 hours a day, if you got people, millennials included, and no matter what the industry, working together on organizational problems in an X-team way, which helps you to diagnose and come up with solutions, that would be a way of creating more solutions to the problem, but also getting people engaged in a way that they aren't currently engaged in their organizational environment.
So are you saying that this is a tension between what people would describe as bureaucracy versus more empowerment and more entrepreneurial cultures? And if that's true, does this apply to huge organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees equally?
Absolutely. So, so there are many large corporations that are trying to move this way, and in fact, because there is distributed information. In fact, we all work on our computers or our tablets or whatever it is. We're all increasingly able to access the same kind of information. Part of what will be a competitive advantage, no matter what size your company, is being able to say, do your sense making. What does all this information mean? And going into nimble organizational forms, which may include a kind of teaming X-team structure that enables you to sense and seize those opportunities and move quickly. And so that is happening both with large organizations, but also with smaller organizations. And in fact, the locus of innovation is no longer with large corporations. It is with smaller organizations or with the partnerships between large-scale organizations and smaller ones, like big pharma with biotech coming together in all kinds of joint ventures or agreements. How do those happen? Those happen by people further down in the organization thinking of which collaborations might work, doing the networking to meet the right people, creating X teams that operate often across organizational boundaries. And so that can happen in large companies. In fact, you might argue that you can have bureaucracy, but on top of the bureaucratic structure is a looser form of networked X teams, which are carrying out some of the innovative processes that are not handled in the regular bureaucratic mode.
I see. So you've talked a couple of times, and in that answer as well, and used phrases like top-down, bottom-up, people lower down in the organization. Presumably that means there are people higher up as well. A close cousin of bureaucracy is often hierarchy. What are you seeing in the companies that you're studying that are being successful with these distributed leadership models? Do they still have hierarchy? Do people still have formal titles and responsibilities? And what happens to accountability?
So almost all of the companies that we've ever looked at have some kind of hierarchy. They often have less hierarchy. That is, there are fewer levels in the organization, and in some places there aren't that even formal titles. So there's, again, a continuum of how far you go on that. To me, hierarchy and bureaucracy are slightly different. A hierarchy has to do with the fact that you have differentiated roles and responsibilities at different levels of the firm, whereas bureaucracy starts getting into defining very clear job demands and the focus of what you can do within a job, within a team, within a certain subunit in an organization. And then there are rules about how you interact across boundaries and how you actually do the work that's being done. So we will, I think, always have hierarchy. In fact, if you just there are computer simulations where you put agents together, and just to get work done, they typically create some kind of hierarchical system where different parts of the organization do different work, and there are fewer people doing some kinds of work than others. But we may see a lot of bureaucratic functions actually substituted by the system that's created. For example, how do you pick people to come in? You can either have the HR department do all the hiring, or you could have teams hire their own people to come into the organization. You could have the managers on top evaluating each of the people in the organization and saying you get to move ahead or you don't. Or you can have everybody on a team evaluate the other members of the team for their contribution, and those are the people who move ahead. So in fact, we see a lot of bureaucratic structures that are top-down being replaced in these organizations by collective processes.
So in these organizations that have these characteristics, it sounds like you're seeing a lot of sort of empowerment and proactivity by people throughout the organization. And let's assume, and I think it's a big assumption, that that's an organization that does have a clear understanding of these simple rules, so people know roughly what as an organization they're trying to achieve, and that gives them some alignment. Still, one would assume there's going to be kind of conflict between, or potential for conflict between different agendas that people have in this distributed organization. So what are you seeing in those kinds of conflict and or need to collaborate in new and different ways? And have you got any advice from those observations for the people listening would be able to act on?
So of course there's conflict. You have any organization has limited resources, and whenever you have limited resources, you're going to have some conflict as to who gets those resources. I think part of what we see in these organizations is that the people up and down the organization are pretty sophisticated. They have high levels of emotional intelligence. They have high levels of cognitive flexibility. They have high levels of emotional regulation and an ability, whether you call it grit or resilience, and there are a lot of terms now in the psychologists look at. I think all of those things are true, and so people are able to handle conflict and resolve it, whether the way in which they resolve it, however, is not always to go up and then seek the manager on top, but to, again, whether there's a choice committee that handles, okay, we only have X amount of resources, so there's some group that decides who gets those resources, or whether teams themselves do the negotiations. That is an ongoing part of what I think we'll see in any organization.
So this depends, it sounds like, on the skills and capabilities that many or all the members of the team and of the organization actually have and can bring to bear, particularly around collaboration. Mm-hmm. Thinking about, you talked earlier about Carol Dweck's work on mindset. Are people really able to change and learn and acquire those skills?
Well, first of all, they are. What these organizations do is also attempt to bring in people who are good with ambiguity, who think of themselves as leaders. Mindset is not only learning versus fixed. There's a lot of work being done now on being able to handle dichotomies. So it's not an either or, it's an and kind of environment. I do believe that you can, and in fact in some of Carol Dweck's experiments you can induce more of a learning mindset, but it's not only about the individual. Again, the context plays a huge role, so you need to start by getting people who can handle being in that kind of environment, having a long socialization process where people learn how to work in that environment, but you also need an environment that rewards people for acting in that way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there, you started talking about globalization as well, and that came up a little earlier. We have people all over the world listening to this webinar. What are you finding in your research are some of the key challenges or differences, both that globalization creates for these kinds of distributed organizations that are operating globally, or are there any examples, perhaps from other countries than the U.S. that you think really stand out as being particularly interesting ones that you've encountered?
Globalization obviously has challenges associated with it because you're pulling together diverse points of view, but also diverse cultures, and so that often puts a little bit of strain on the situation. It also often means a lot of travel. So even though my sustainability colleagues would not be pleased about that, even though a lot of the collaboration and networking can be done electronically, it really helps to have some of that connectivity be in person. And so what we find in the organizations operating like this is that people are actually moving about on a global basis. But once those networks are created, then again you've got an infrastructure which enables more cross-boundary kinds of collaborations to occur because people know who who is where in the world and what do those folks bring to the table. It's sometimes a challenge because this kind of leadership requires that people step forward, be entrepreneurial. Some cultures, that's not a respected way of operating, and so that could be a challenge. But certainly, in some of the work that we've done, we've seen companies step up to this. Even if we talk about exec ed, we could talk about Li and Fung and their networked organizational forms. We're working with Takeda, which is a global organization. We've just run some X-Team projects that have brought together the resources of multiple parts of the R&D organization, whether that be in Japan or Cambridge or Deerfield.
Great. So networked organizations are clearly going to be extremely important for the agility and ability to deal with all the change and uncertainty that we're increasingly seeing in the world. But it's easier to say than to do. I think that's what we've been hearing. We've got a lot more questions coming in, but unfortunately right now we're just running out of time. And so it really falls to me to thank you, Professor Deborah Ancona. But in closing, we have had a lot of questions about the resources that you have mentioned and what other resources are available to people. On the screen right now, here are the executive education programs that Professor Ancona mentioned that she has developed and teaches in here at the MIT Sloan School. We also have another slide, and we'll be sharing these later, with some of the featured reading that Professor Ancona mentioned. And so there's some good material here for everyone to be able to get into. And all that remains for me is to thank all of you for logging in, tuning in, and participating actively. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you, Professor Deborah Ancona, and we look forward to seeing everyone in future Innovation at Work webinars.
And I'd like to add my thanks to everybody for tuning in, and to you, Peter, for facilitating the whole event.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thanks to all our participants for joining us today. We hope you found this webcast presentation informative. This concludes our webcast. You may now disconnect. Have a good day.